1650 and continuing for the next 75 years, two competing visions about how civilized government should be conducted struggled to assert themselves. Absolutism, government dominated by a single focus of power, competed against constitutionalism. The absolutist king Louis XIV of France demonstrated that government could be effective under a single monarch, though notions of freedom and liberty were strictly limited. In England, the pattern of administration took a decidedly different direction. There, constitutionalism began to establish itself as the way in which a free people could govern themselves, not top-down, but bottom-up. We will first look at absolutism as practiced by Louis XIV, and then the alternative as it emerged in England. And then we want to look at the legacy of John Locke. The last half of the 17th century was the age of France. Its population, 18 million in 1650, dwarfed that of Spain and England. Its economy and military were the largest in Europe, and much of Europe imitated its culture. But French power had its limits: high taxation, government regulation of the economy, religious persecution, and censorship stunted economic growth. Militarily, Louis XIV's attempts to dominate Western Europe brought together a series of coalitions against France and compelled even the magnificent Sun King to recognize the limits of the balance of power. Louis XIV was the living symbol of French military, political, and cultural domination. He was born in 1638, took power decisively into his own hands in 1661, and died at the age of 77. By temperament and training, he incarnated the divine right monarchy, the notion that hereditary monarchy was the only divine approved form of government, that kings answered to God alone for their conduct, and that subjects owed absolute obedience to their king as the direct representative of God on earth. Louis may not have said the famous words often ascribed to him, "I am the state," but he certainly operated under that governing principle. He sought to personify that concept of sovereignty. He took a deep interest in the elaborate etiquette and ceremonies of his court because it showed how dominant he was over the nobility. He also conducted the business of state in person as his own first minister. He had his pastimes, hunting and womanizing, but he was perfectly willing to set them aside when the business of state demanded it. He said, "If you let yourself be carried away by your passions, don't do it in business hours." Louis wrote his son multiple notes on the art of ruling. He said, "Most princes, because they have a great many servants and subjects, they do not consider that they have an infinite number of people working under their orders. They are infinitely more to rely on their conduct, and it takes a great deal of watching and a great deal of work merely to ensure that those who act do only what they should, and those who rely on tolerance only what they must." The deference and respect that we receive from our subjects are not a free gift from them. They are payment for the justice and perfection that they expect to receive from us. Just as they must honor us, we must protect and defend them, and our debt toward them are even more binding than them to us. For indeed, if one of them lacks the skill or the willingness to execute our orders, 1,000 others come in a crowd to fill his post, whereas the position of the sovereign can properly be filled only by the sovereign himself. Louis domesticated the nobility. He led the domination of European culture. He attempted to dominate Europe militarily, though in this last he failed. But perhaps his destruction of the Huguenots was the most egregious example of absolutism at work. When Queen Maria Theresa died in 1683, Louis began to become increasingly concerned about the fate of his immortal soul. He gave up all of his mistresses, except the pious Madame de Maintenon, whom he secretly married. His growing religious enthusiasm had political implications, of course. He went after the Catholics first. He persecuted the Jansenists, a group of Catholic Puritans who emphasized the teachings of St. Augustine on original sin, the depravity of man, and the need for divine grace. Louis, whose confessors were Jesuits, thought that the Jansenists were impertinent in their disapproval of his numerous mistresses and agreed with the Pope that the Jansenists were subversive. He destroyed their principal monastic center, beginning in 1710. But it was the Huguenots, Calvinist-oriented Protestants, one of the most loyal and industrious groups in France, who felt the full force of Louis XIV's religious enthusiasm. By 17th century standards, two religions under one prince was strange. The French Catholic clergy had long insisted that the continued existence of Protestantism in France was an insult to the king's dignity and authority. After 1679, Louis heartily embraced the idea of atoning for his numerous sins of the flesh by crushing heresy in France. He began by gradually tightening his interpretation of the Edict of Nantes, by which his predecessor, King Henry IV, had granted toleration to the Huguenots, thus ending France's religious wars in 1498. Louis then proceeded to engage in forced conversions of Protestants, the destruction of Protestant chapels, and the quartering of royal troops in the homes of Protestant families. In 1685, he took the final step. At the urging of his Jesuit advisors, he announced that since all heretics had reconverted to Catholicism, the Edict of Nantes no longer served any purpose and was therefore revoked. The state closed all remaining Protestant churches and schools, and the church baptized all Protestant children as Catholics. Louis enforced the revocation by imprisonment and torture and condemnation to servitude on government ships called galleys. Many Huguenots continued to practice their faith in secret, but many, almost 200,000, over one-fifth of the Protestant population of France, fled to Holland, England, Germany, and the New World. There, their industry and skill contributed exceedingly to the rapid economic growth of their new homes. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes was an act of religious intolerance that was not equaled in the 17th century, a large-scale act of barbarism that was purely religious in origin. It was the last such attempt in Western Europe until Germany's attempt to exterminate the European Jews between 1941 and 1944. While Louis XIV was struggling to consolidate absolute monarchy in France, the English created a constitutional monarchy controlled by Parliament. After nearly 20 years of struggle, 2 civil wars, the trial and execution of a divine right monarch, the Restoration brought King Charles II to the throne of England, but even then, the equilibrium between Crown and Parliament was unstable. Who will exercise sovereignty, the king or the elected representatives of the political nation in Parliament? Charles II was utterly unlike his stubborn father. He was witty, attractive, he was a worldly king, a man of healthy sexual appetites and shrewd political sense. After spending long years in exile in France, Charles was determined not to risk exile or execution in the manner of his father. Instead, he hoped to restore England to Catholicism and to establish a French-style absolute monarchy through manipulation and compromise. He largely failed in this ambition, but it was not without trying. The so-called Cavalier Parliament of 1661 through 1679 was the preserve of the gentry and the aristocracy, now partially restored to their ancient influence in both local and national government. The majority of Parliament was strongly royalist in its sentiment and determined to stamp out all remaining political and religious radicalism. But they also had no intention of allowing Charles to be independent financially from Parliament. The ruling majority in Parliament granted Charles a regular income from customs duties, but it was not enough to meet even the ordinary expenses of government, let alone the expenses of Charles' wild doings at court, or his numerous mistresses, or his numerous illegitimate children. Therefore, Charles allowed Parliament, under the leadership of his father's advisor, Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, to have its way for a time. Clarendon himself favored toleration, at least to a certain degree, but was perfectly willing to help exclude from local government Puritans who dissented from the established church, and together he and Parliament purged Puritan ministers from the Anglican clergy, most notoriously on St. Bartholomew's Day, 1672, when hundreds of Puritan clergy were banished from their pulpits. Later legislation barred dissenters from Parliament, from service in the Army and the Navy, or from teaching at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. While their efforts lowered the social status of dissenters and narrowed their opportunities, it did not greatly decrease the number of Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, and Quakers who formed persistent and numerous religious minorities and opposition to both Anglicanism, the Church of England, and Roman Catholicism. Charles himself acted as though he was interested in toleration, and as a first step to restoring Catholicism in 1672, he issued a declaration of indulgence that suspended parliamentary prohibitions against both Puritans and Catholics and appeared to assert, in the manner of his executed father, the royal prerogative which could thwart acts of Parliament. Unfortunately, his act was too clever by half, and Parliament forced him to withdraw the declaration and imposed upon him a test act that excluded non-Anglicans from civil and military office. Charles was very much aware that this test act that he signed also prohibited the elevation of his brother James, Duke of York, to the throne, since James was a practicing Catholic. The banner years of 1665 through 1666 sent shivers of fear through the political nation. Two natural calamities, a fierce outbreak of the bubonic plague that killed 60,000 of the 450,000 inhabitants of the City of London, and a fire that destroyed much of the city the following year, combined with a commercial war with the Dutch, which Parliament forced Charles into a conflict, but then denied him the money needed to win. In 1670, Charles allied England with the Catholic France and signed the notorious secret Treaty of Dover. In the treaty, Louis XIV offered money and French troops if Charles were to declare himself a Catholic and reconvert England to Catholicism. Charles, ever the clever Charles, also extracted from Louis a secret subsidy of £200,000 per year. He spent the money with impunity, but did little to fulfill his responsibilities under the treaty. The political nation began to hear rumors of the contents of the treaty, and this ramped up fears of French influence and a return to Catholicism. By 1678, this combination of events and fears dominated the national discourse. All this exploded during the lurid Popish plot. A disreputable former Anglican clergyman by the name of Titus Oates concocted a story about a Jesuit plot to kill the king, to place his Catholic brother James, Duke of York, on the throne with French help, and to massacre English Protestants. A new civil war seemed about to break out. Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, a great landowner who had fought for Parliament in the Civil War and then turned to the Royalist side just in time for the Restoration, formed a country party that campaigned freely to exclude James from the succession to the throne. In response, an Anglican and Royalist court party assembled, though without much enthusiasm, to support Charles II and his brother. The court party denigrated the Shaftesbury group as Whigs, a name hitherto applied to Scottish Presbyterian rebels, but was even more derisive as it was derived from the word Whigamore, or Scottish cattle drivers. In turn, the Whigs baptized their antagonists Tories, a kind of Irish Catholic brigand. It's vitally important to understand that these were impulses and groups of convenience that gathered together on particular matters. It was not an official political party. These two would become the heart of the future Tory and Whig parties. But this was just the beginning of the experience and the development of these two different impulses. During the three parliaments that followed the dissolution of the Cavalier Parliament in 1679, Shaftesbury and his associates dominated politics, but they overplayed their hand by seeking the execution of many Catholics. Public opinion swung back. Public opinion swung back in favor of the king and against the Whigs, so much so that by 1681 Shaftesbury had fled abroad. The inventors of the Popish plot were disgraced or executed, and Charles II was stronger than any English monarch since the early days of James I. Until his death in 1685, Charles ruled without calling Parliament into session, with his brother James by his side, and with the subsidies of Louis XIV filling his coffers. This struggle between king and factions in Parliament created the ancestors of modern political parties, groups organized for the purpose of electioneering and of controlling government through the nation's representative assembly in Parliament. Whigs and Tories were in part actually the descendants of the parliamentarians and royalists of the 1640s civil wars. The great crisis of the 1680s, however, instead of a civil war, produced a system of parliamentary rule that England later passed on to its colonies and indirectly to the West as a whole. James, Duke of York, succeeded his brother Charles II in 1685 as King James II. He was a bigoted convert to Catholicism who lacked Charles's shrewdness and flexibility, and within 3 years he had infuriated almost every political and religious group of importance in England, and he had provoked the revolution that Charles II had succeeded in avoiding. Early successes made him overconfident. He then introduced Catholics into high command of both the army and the navy, and encamped a standing army a few miles from London. He surrounded himself with Catholic advisors and attacked Anglican control of the universities. He claimed the power to suspend or dispense with acts of Parliament. In a vain attempt to win the support of Puritans as well as Catholics, all kinds of dissenters, he issued a second declaration of indulgence along the lines of his brothers, thus further alienated the Anglican establishment. By threatening to revoke borough charters and browbeating sheriffs, he tried to ensure the election of a parliament favorable to his policies. These measures, along with the example of Louis XIV's 1865 revocation of the Edict of Nantes across the Channel in France, terrified English Protestants. Now, the nation could have tolerated a good bit of this unlawful manipulation because of its devotion to the monarchy, but an event transpired in 1688 that set the Protestant succession at peril, and whether he recognized it or not, doomed the monarchy of James II. He and his Catholic queen announced the unexpected birth of a son and heir in June 1688. This exploded all of the quiet confidence expectation and plans of English Protestants. They had consoled themselves with the thought that James and his queen were barren, and that his two older daughters by another marriage, Mary and Anne, were Protestants and would succeed James. Now the existence of a Catholic male heir prolonged the Catholic threat indefinitely into the future. But, unlike the events of 1641, the intense political tension of 1688 did not produce a civil war. This time, the king had no king's party. He had alienated Anglicans, offended dissenters, alienated Tories and Whigs and aristocrats and commoners and merchants and farmers. The result, instead, was a bloodless revolution, a rapid, fundamental political change that established the limited or parliamentary monarchy that has persisted to the present. The catalyst of James' downfall was William of Orange, the hero of the Dutch Republic, the man who had, in 1677, in pursuit of allies against France, married James II's eldest daughter, Mary, and had thus acquired a claim to the English throne. In June 1688, a group of prominent Englishmen, both Whigs and Tories, invited William to cross the English Channel and save the Protestant cause in England. That November, William landed a Dutch army on the southern coast and marched slowly toward London. The countryside rose not against William, but against James, and William tactfully allowed the friendless king to flee to France. It is said that on his way out of the country, sailing down the Thames, James cast the Great Seal of England into the waters of that great river. An improvised parliament decreed that James had abdicated the throne by his flight and invited William and Mary to become joint sovereigns on a condition that they accept a Bill of Rights, a Declaration of Rights, that severely limited royal power. This bloodless, glorious revolution established at last the sovereignty of Parliament, which made a king and could regulate the succession to the throne. Now, William was strong-willed, but his priorities were continental and Dutch, the forging of an ever more powerful coalition against Louis XIV. He therefore grudgingly accepted Parliament's conditions. The supporters of James II and his son kept trying to return. However, they invaded Ireland in 1690 and then staged two bloody rebellions in the Scottish Highlands in 1715 and 1745. But all such attempts at a second restoration failed. Parliament had won. The Bill of Rights emphatically barred the king from suspending acts of Parliament or interfering with the courts. It furnished a base for the steady expansion of civil liberties in the generation after 1688. Parliament established religious toleration and freedom from arbitrary arrest. Censorship of the press gradually, quietly withered. The king had to summon Parliament annually, for he could neither pay nor control his armed forces without parliamentary consent and regular subsidy. Regular meetings in Parliament, in turn, strengthened the parties and made the king dependent on their support. The British monarch vetoed a parliamentary bill for the last time in 1707. I want to speak now on the legacy of John Locke. The English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, along with the Dutch revolt against Spain, were the events that ended absolute monarchy and ultimately led to democratic representative government. Now, the weight of tradition demanded that English leaders in 1641 through 1649 and 1688 through 1689 deny that these acts were revolutionary. Really? Parliament chopped off the head of one divine right king and replaced another in the name of the traditional liberties of England. But this constitutional artifice had little connection to reality. They were fooling no one. These were revolutions. John Locke, 1632 through 1704, who with his friend the Earl of Shaftesbury, Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, had helped found the Whig Party in the 1680s, provided the theoretical foundation for what Parliament had done in the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688, and for the subsequent evolution of representative government. In 1690, Locke released Of Civil Government, 2 treatises. In these writings, he answered Thomas Hobbes' justification of absolute sovereignty with a convincing theory of limited government. Hobbes, who had attempted to justify divine right absolutist government in his massive volume Leviathan, released in 1651, had met his match. Locke attacked Hobbes' notion that the only alternative to anarchy was absolute authority. According to Hobbes, the state of man was a perpetual, restless desire of power after power. Without some supreme authority to enforce law, no society or order could exist, but only produced a war of every man against every man. Life without arbitrary dictatorial government, according to Hobbes, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Locke's first principle was that all individuals possessed a natural right to life, liberty, and property. That notion was revolutionary in his age of entrenched privilege, and it remains revolutionary in our own, in which dictatorships rule most of humanity. From this premise of natural rights, and from a more optimistic view of human nature than that of Hobbes, Locke derived the rest of his system. Like Hobbes and many of his predecessors and contemporaries, Locke argued that government was a contract in which humanity exchanged the anarchy of the state of nature for the security that government provided. Locke's insisted that these rights were natural and existed prior to the establishment of all government allowed him, unlike Hobbes, to limit the authority of government. A source of sovereignty, thanks to the natural rights of the governed, was the governed themselves. He said, "The people alone can appoint the form of the Commonwealth." It therefore followed for Locke that a government acting without the consent of the governed thereby dissolved the contract and gave the subject the right to resistance or even revolution. Locke also provided a principle for the ordering of government. Fearing the concentration of power, he proposed a strict separation of powers that would allow the elected representative of the people to check a tyrannical executive. The purpose of government itself, he said, the great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government, is the preservation of their property. In the 1700s, Locke's ideas were a powerful rationale for society based on wealth rather than inherited privilege, and for a new kind of government, limited in its powers, inalienable natural rights that were inherent, which could not and should not be alienated from individuals, government by consent, right of revolution, and the sanctity of property seemed increasingly self-evident to Englishmen after 1688 and ultimately to the American colonists in 1776. The 75 years, 1650 to 1725, was a period of dramatic change. Absolute divine right monarchy reached its height in the France of Louis XIV. Powers from Madrid to St. Petersburg attempted to imitate the French model to greater or lesser extent. Nevertheless, a few small peoples, such as the Swiss, rejected monarchy in favor of a republican government. But it took England's glorious revolution and the defeat of Louis XIV by English arms to demonstrate to history and to the world that even the very greatest powers could choose alternatives to absolute monarchy, indeed, could gradually over a period of time develop freedom, government, and limited constitutional government.